Well, good morning, good afternoon if you're connecting from Europe. Welcome to the final session on climate resilient PPPs. Just a quick reminder, we started this webinars early this month talking about the experience of Jamaica with the development bank authorities of the PPP cycle in the country. Then last week we to create resilient identification and the business case to have great colleagues and from IDB Invest, from IMG Rebel, to talk more about financing solutions using and the management phase with the material discussing is being published in these two papers. All the tool is open for consultation. The link has been shared. We will be sending reminders, and the consultation is open until the end of July. So please help us making this document a bit more complete and a bit more practical. As for the agenda today, we have Riccardo Galindi, De Vecchi Galindi, head of PPPs at Invest. He will be giving us some opening remarks, especially considering the perspective of the private sector in PPPs. Then our colleagues from IMG Rebel, Christine and Marcel, will present the section of the toolkit focused on procurement and contracts. And then we enter in blended finance solutions with Mathieu Pegon, head of blended finance at the IDB Invest. Christina, and then with Christina Paul, senior infrastructure finance specialist at the World Bank, we look at contract clauses and how to include climate in the transaction phase. We hope to have some closing reflection from DBJ, from Ricardo Moro. I'm Gianleo Frisari and I'll be moderating the webinar today. Without further ado, Ricardo, please get us started. Thank you.
Gianleo, and thanks to the climate division of the IDB for inviting me to this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here with you today to discuss about resiliency, which I am convinced is one of the most important topics when it comes to contemporary infrastructure, if I may, especially considering topics of climate change and the recent COVID crisis. So I really want to congratulate Gianleo for developing this toolkit, which we're presenting throughout this webinar. It's very complete and it shows how government authorities can actually implement resiliency measures into infrastructure, which is really, really useful, as I mentioned, in today's world. After reading the toolkit, I wanted to share some of my thoughts, because one of the main things that I've seen throughout my my professional career is that even though governments are cognizant that we have to implement resiliency into infrastructure, they sometimes are reticent to include these measures, because they immediately think that if they go to a tender, they tender a project, an infrastructure project with this resiliency measures, that might affect the bankability of the project or the interest of the private sector in the project. And so it is true. Most of the cases, and it says it throughout you can see it throughout the toolkit, whenever we implement resiliency characteristics into infrastructure, it might increase the cost of developing the infrastructure. And in turn, this might affect profitability, and in turn, this might affect bankability. But in my view, and I think that's what I want to with you, I believe that perception, the perception of the government, that this might, including resiliency measures, might affect bankability, is an erroneous perception. When we prepare projects well, when we execute them well, resilience PPPs can actually be attractive to the private sector. Now, this doesn't mean that all the projects that we present resiliency characteristics into will be bankable, but it does, preparing them well and executing them well will increase the the possibilities of success of the project and the interest of the private sector. So there's sort of like a secret and an art. No? The secret is first, we follow all the recommendations that we can see throughout the toolkit. And second is to know the resources that governments have to improve the perception of the private sector in an infrastructure project. So I know that the rest of the panel will talk specifically about some issues that have to deal with financing, that have to deal with preparing projects, that have to deal with the structuring, that have to deal with some tools to increase bankability or to increase the attractiveness of the private sector into the projects. So I'm just going to try to give a brief preview of what we're talking about and what we can think about when we develop resilient infrastructure. So first of all, it's important to recognize that the perception of the private sector of resilient PPPs begins not at the moment we start the tender process, not even when we design the tender documents or the PPP contract. The perception starts well before these milestones and is the result of a combination of a series of factors which include, among other elements, strong legal framework in the country, solid institutional environment, preferably some track record of the country implementing similar tender processes, and of course, full support of the government. But these are requirements for all PPP tender processes, either for resilient or non-resilient infrastructure. There is, however, an element that governments have to put a lot of attention into when it comes to resilient PPPs, and that is their commitment. They have to show their commitment to resilience in infrastructure. This is done by making the sector aware, the private sector aware of how important it is to include these measures into the development of infrastructure projects. For example, there's a study by the Institute of Building Sciences that shows that for every dollar spent on resilient infrastructure, you save $6 on future costs. That might include economic disruptions, property damage, public health crisis, and deaths caused by extreme disasters. Another study by The Economist mentions that the expected value of at-risk losses to manageable global infrastructure assets from an increase in 2 degrees centigrade in average temperatures, what it meant $4.2 trillion in overcosts in 2015. So right here, I'm trying to make the private sector aware of how important it is to have resiliency measures. There's another tool that the governments can use, and that's the MDBs. And MDBs can actually help governments promote resiliency measures in both in the private sectors and also within the citizenry. And so we've done it in the past. We've done it at IDB Invest. IDB has done it. The World Bank has done it, and this is part of our work, trying to make aware of the importance of having these resiliency measures embedded into infrastructure projects. The structure of a plan we have to develop them a plan together, and the MDBs can help governments develop a resilient infrastructure plan even before we start building a pipeline of PPP projects. And this can also be made through the help of MDBs. Now, the structure of a plan to promote resilient infrastructure and making the private sector aware of the importance of this type of projects in the country can pave the way for the definition of a pipeline of resilient PPPs. Now, a solid pipeline of resilient PPPs will allow us to elect a project and subsequently structure its tender. Now, at this juncture, the government should make sure that the project has the characteristics to be attractive to the private sector at face value. For example, if we're talking about the highway, the government should make sure that traffic is adequate to sustain a PPP. It is also at this point that the governments can decide to make the project more attractive by assuming some of the resiliency investment that will be needed. For example, we recently had a project where we had a plot of land and it had some issues with flooding. And so, one of my recommendations was for the government to even before they start the infrastructure project, to try to fix this flooding problem. So that will that will on the first hand make the project more bankable for the private sector, but on the other hand, it will also show the commitment of the government to develop this project. They will put some quote unquote skin on the game of the government into this projects. This also will reduce the risks and costs for the private sector, and will show the commitment, and that will enhance in turn the bankability prospects. So once in the structuring process, which includes both drafting the PPP contract and the tender documents, it goes without saying that there should be an adequate risk allocation and the identification of a clear payment mechanism, among other factors. During this stage, the government should identify the main resiliency-related risks and decide how they want to share them with the private sector. So they have several options. They can request the private sector to include resiliency characteristics into the project as a requirement to propose to have their proposal ready. They can incentivize the inclusion of resiliency measures. So they can say, if you include this resiliency measure, we can give you certain perks or certain points or certain incentives, or you can have a mixture of both options. Now, doing this and understanding which ones we have to make an obligatory resiliency issues or mandatory, or or other issues that can be optional, that mixture, if we decide to do a mixture, will also have an effect on the perception of the private sector, because the private sector is going to look at the project and going to see, well, if this is a good mix of mandatory and additional resiliency measures, I'm as a company, I'm going to be interested more in the project. So once the resiliency measures have been identified, the government should decide if their implementation will affect bankability. In the implementation of these resiliency measures will affect bankability. This can be done by requesting support from MDBs and requesting their opinion, requesting the opinion of technical consultants, or even holding meetings with the potential bidders in the project. So we can actually reach out to the private sector and ask them, what do you look for in this project? We want to embed this resiliency measures into infrastructure. How do you think we can do it? What are your recommendations? What would you do? What would it take for you to be included in this process, or for us to include in this process for it to make it attractive to you? After doing the analysis, we conclude that the implementation of resiliency measures can affect bankability. Governments have a series of options and tools to address the issue, no? And so they can, for example, do cost sharing in the construction of resiliency infrastructure. So part of the infrastructure should be paid by the government and part should be paid by the private sector. We can establish warranties or define warranties. We can provide tax incentives or provide monetary incentives, or get additional NDV support such as blended finance. So I'm not going to go into all of them, but this is where the art comes, and knowing when to use tax incentives, knowing where to provide monetary incentives, knowing when to establish warranties, or even cost sharing, or other tools that we might have. Some of my recommendations would be that you should use cost sharing whenever the cost of the incurring an infrastructure cost that it's the resiliency infrastructure that's really expensive. You can actually consider sharing the cost with the private sector. You can use tax incentives when you require for the private sector to increase resilience in the project, requires for them to import some raw materials or some equipment from abroad. So you can actually give them discounts in tariffs, for example. You can also, for example, increase payments increase the payments that the government gives to the private sector, or increase the payments that the users give to the operator, to motivate the private companies to fulfill key performance indicators related to resiliency. And to all the aforementioned tools, in order to improve the perception of the private sector, we should adequately capture best practices to insurance requirements and force majeure clauses. You can see, and as I mentioned at the beginning, there's a plethora of options that governments can actually use to increase bankability of resiliency projects and to increase and therefore improving the perception of the private sector into infrastructure, resilient infrastructure. These are just a quick points and quick perceptions that I have that I want to share with you, and I hope these are useful, and I hope they work to open the rest of the discussion with the rest of the panelists. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you for really give us a very comprehensive overview of what we're going to discuss today. I think that just highlighting a few things you mentioned is the necessity of the dialogue with the private sector, and that this dialogue needs to start as early as possible. I think you mentioned, and we saw it in the last webinar, how important it is to address this risk, identify this risk as early as possible in the process. You mentioned issues of bankability, that is not just a matter of cost, but is a matter of long-term profile and sustainability of the infrastructure. And you mentioned the potential solutions we have, and we're going to see today with the cost-sharing, blending finance, and managing contracts. So really, I think it was a really complete overview. Christine, we addressed a few of these issues in the toolkit. Please, let's get in and see how the toolkit can be supportive in these phases of procurement and transaction management of the PPP. Thank you.
Great. Can you,
Christine, before you mention, you start one housekeeping man. If you have questions, especially for Ricardo, who has to leave in a few minutes, please put them in the platform, in the chat, and we'll try to address them with Ricardo before he leaves. Sorry, Christine. Thank you.
No problem. Can everybody see my screen and the slides, just to check?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Jean-Leo, and thank you very much, Ricardo, for your opening remarks. So as Jean-Leo mentioned, my name is Christine Shepard, and my colleague Marcel Ham and I are from ING Rebel, and today we'll present a piece of the toolkit we developed on climate resilient PPPs in conjunction with IDB and the Development Bank of Jamaica. And we're going to look specifically at the levers of procurement and contractual clauses. Before I get going, just to show everybody the breadth of the toolkit and to maybe entice you to go check it out, this toolkit has kind of decision-making tools or how-tos at every stage of the PPP project cycle. So from the project identification to the business case analysis to transaction and contract management phases. But today, we're really going to focus in on the transaction stage, and we're going to specifically focus on 5 tools that we think really help illustrate how PPP procurement and the PPP contract can really incentivize climate resilience or make sure that your infrastructure project is built and is climate resilient. So I also want to note that to illustrate these concepts today, we've decided to use a fictional case. There are cases out there, but we didn't find one case of a great climate resilient project that helps illustrate all the concepts we want to talk about. So today we're going to use this fictional case of a small island country that needs to rehabilitate a large portion of a coastal road, and they've decided, they decided in their business case phase that they want to do it as a design, build, finance, operate, and maintain PPP for 25 years, and it will be done on an availability payment method. So the private sector partner will be paid provided that the asset is in the condition as set out in the availability requirements. In this case, we also know that the project is medium to high risk for various climate hazards. So it faces risk of floods, hurricanes, landslides, and heat. So every so often as we go through today, we'll kind of bring up this fictional case to help illustrate some of the concepts. So in In a PPP procurement process, oftentimes it'll be done in 2 stages. So oftentimes first there will be an RFQ stage, or request for qualification stage. And the purpose of this stage, this initial stage, is to screen for competent firms that are capable of managing the project. So it helps to ensure that you don't have a ton of bidders who maybe aren't qualified to do the project, wasting their time and resources to prepare the bids. And on the same vein, it's helpful for the government to ensure that they have a manageable number of bidders. So when they're evaluating the eventual request for proposals, that they're not spending tons of time evaluating many bidders who aren't qualified. And as part of this typical PPP procurement stage, it's possible, we found, to think about including climate resilience goals into that. So when we were thinking about this in the toolkit, we've identified 3 different ways of doing this in the RFQ. So this is in tool 3.1. So one of the ways is to just have a minimum requirement. So in requesting in the RFQ documentation with the request information from the potential bidders, you can request information on projects that they have completed that show that they have sufficient experience managing a project with a similar climate profile. And then when evaluating that documentation from the bidders, you can decide, hey, they passed or they failed. So if they pass, they can continue on to compete in the RFP stage. And if they fail, they don't have the required experience that we need, then you can, say sorry. Another mechanism for doing this in the evaluation stage is to have, you have selection criteria. So there's various selection criteria, and one of those criterion could be, for instance, the bidder's extent of past experience with projects of a similar climate risk profile, and whether they, effectively mitigated the climate risks. And that can be graded on a 100-point scale. So, say a bidder submits something and you look at their projects, it looks like they did a good job. So they got 80 out of 100 points on their climate resilience qualifications, and then that score will then be added to the other scores, and then you would get an overall score to determine which bidders would proceed. And then the final approach would be to use kind of a combination of the 2. So you would have a criterion on the extent of past experience with the projects of a similar climate risk profile, but then you would have kind of a minimum score that they must get on this criterion in order to pass through. So in here, we've suggested maybe 70%. So those are just a few ways that in the pre-qualification stage, teams can already start to include climate resilience goals. So for our fictional case, so our small island country, they have their coastal road project, and they know that it's important enough to them, to make it climate resilience. There's enough climate risk that they want to already go ahead and include climate resilience goals in the pre-qualification stage. So they've invited bidders to submit their qualifications, and as part of that, they have a minimum requirement that they need to show that they have experience managing projects with a similar climate profile. So in this case, in our fictional case, there's 10 potential bidders, but upon the review of all of their qualifications, they found that only 5 have the requisite experience managing projects of a similar climate risk profile. So 5 failed and 5 passed. Moving on to more generally for PPP procurement and the PPP contracts, there's kind of, Ricardo touched on this a bit in his opening remarks, but we see sort of there's 2 main ways governments can choose to include climate resilience and ensure that the PPP project ends up being developed in a climate resilient way and is climate resilient throughout its life. So one key way is to use minimum requirements. So if a procuring agency knows what it wants in terms of climate resilience, so it has very specific requirements that it needs in terms of the technical requirements or the design specifications, then the procuring agency may want to think about, using the minimum requirements and to ensure that climate resilience goals are included. So in order to do this, though, they really need to have the skills in the procuring agency to be able to set those requirements. So they need to have the people that know, hey, this road needs to have this certain type of pavement that is more permeable so that there's less flooding risk, and be able to set that. On the other hand, another way that the procuring agency can go about ensuring this is through the evaluation criteria of the request for proposal stage. So in this case, if the procuring agency knows that they really want to ensure that the project is climate resilient, but it's more open-ended and they really want the private sector parties that are bidding to come up with great ideas or innovative solutions, then they can choose to say, as part of the RFP documentation, to say, you know, present these plans and we will evaluate or score you based on whether we think you've proposed a good solution. In order to do this, again, the procuring agency needs to have the skills within itself to be able to evaluate any eventual proposals received. And I must add that it's not an either or here. In the same project, you could potentially use both of these. So you could have minimum requirements and as well evaluate potential bidders based on certain aspects of their climate resilience plans. So to talk on the minimum requirements side, often in PPPs, you have output specifications. So they set certain standards and the private sector would come up with ways to achieve those standards. So in that process of setting these output specifications, there are several ways to think about including climate resilience. And in tool 3.3 of the toolkit, we provide several frameworks of how to think about this or to help teams who are in this process determine, you know, where and when should we think about including climate aims. So when getting started, teams should really look back to the business case stage analysis. If the project is at risk for certain climate hazards, if the project location is subject to climate risk, if various project goals will be affected by certain climate hazards, then okay, maybe you start to think like when we start developing these standards, we need to think whether we can embed climate resilience goals. So when thinking about doing the design and construction standards, you need to think, are there certain materials that we need to request that be used? Are there certain prescriptive design requirements that we need? When developing the requirements for the definition of availability, so the definition of whether the asset is available and the condition it's needed to be, and that determines the payment the private sector receives. We need to determine, are there certain performance requirements that are so important that they need to be included in that definition, and that if the private sector doesn't deliver on those performance requirements, then their availability payment would be deducted, or we would determine that the asset is not available. And similarly, are there any other performance standards that maybe aren't critical enough to be included in the definition of availability, but are important for climate resilience that we need to include in these output specifications? So back to our fictional case again. The team, excuse me. The team with their coastal road, their project is at risk for certain climate hazards, and those are floods, hurricanes, and higher temperatures. So when they're developing their output specifications, they're thinking, okay, at the developing design and construction standards, they need to understand, what can they do? So they've come up with the idea that, okay, flooding is a big risk, so the standards that we use for drainage mechanisms need to be for a pretty high level peak flow of water. So they set that standard pretty high. And then they also have set a standard for asphalt permeability. In terms of setting the standards for what it means for the asset to be available, they've decided that, part of the definition of availability includes that the drainage ditches along the road must be clear of debris and trash. And if they find that there's non-conformance with that, that can result in deductions and payments. And in terms of other performance standards, often as part of PPPs, there will be requirements for the private sector to provide their reporting requirements. So one of those reporting requirements in this case would be the requirement to regularly update a disaster response plan on an annual basis, and the private sector would be, the private party would be responsible for that. So I'm going to now hand it over to my colleague Marcel, who will take us through how to think about embedding climate resilience into the evaluation of PPPs during the RFP stage.
Thank you. So where Christine just focused on the on minimum requirements, the mandatory requirements to incentivize bidders to ensure climate resilience, I want to talk about the other approach, which is to include climate resilience in the PPP evaluation criteria. And before I'm going to dive into this, I want to make an important point on this tool and also all the other tools in the toolkit, and that is that we have tried to, as much as possible, come up with mechanisms to integrate climate resilience in already existing PPP mechanisms. So we're not trying to come up with all kinds of new methods and tools and approaches that require an overhaul of how we would normally do a PPP procurement. But instead, we're trying to find ways to integrate climate resilience, climate risk mitigation into already existing mechanisms. And that is one such mechanism is a PPP evaluation criteria. And a condition for us to incorporate climate resilience in the PPP evaluation criteria is that the evaluation is based on best value, which is very common for PPPs. So I don't think I've ever seen a PPP procurement where lowest price was the main or the evaluation criterion. So it's always a combination of public goals, and one such public goal can be climate resilience, or the extent to which climate resilience is strengthened in the bidder's proposals. So that's one condition. The other condition for us to consider climate resilience in PPP evaluation is that climate resilience is actually important enough to elevate it to the level of an evaluation criterion. And that is directly informed, as basically everything we're doing in this stage, this transaction stage, by what we did in the previous stages. So during the last week's webinar, we talked about how climate risk assessments are a logical step in the pre-feasibility and feasibility stages of project preparation. Those climate risk assessments gives us a good understanding of whether there is a climate risk, and also what the specific climate hazards are. If climate risk is not a very big deal for a project, maybe we don't need to consider it for inclusion in the evaluation criteria. Okay, so now diving into evaluation criteria, in the tools we're discussing two approaches. One is to make it a separate criterion, another one is to integrate it in already existing criteria. Focusing on separate criterion first. So apparently, the conclusion is that climate resilience is important enough to make it a separate evaluation criteria. What it can look like is on the one hand, there will probably be price will be one of the evaluation criteria, and on the other hand, there's going to be several technical evaluation criteria, maybe some related to design of a project, or to the operations plan or maintenance plan. And so in that system, we can also incorporate climate resilience, or the quality and robustness of a climate risk mitigation plan. And then we would award points to that evaluation criterion, incentivizing bidders to come up with the best or most robust climate risk mitigation plan. So again, we would only do this if we're expecting that bidders can actually come up with something meaningful and will do something that the government would have not come up with itself. One important point on this mechanism is also that when we decide to include this climate resilience in the evaluation criteria, we should also be clear in the submission requirements where bidders are supposed to describe their climate risk mitigation plan. In this case, it is very likely that the RFP would say, as part of your technical proposal, please submit a climate risk mitigation plan of no more than 25 pages covering the following topics, building on the climate risk assessment that was developed in the earlier stages. So that's an important. So the evaluation criteria and submission requirements go hand in hand. Moving on to the other approach. Now climate resilience is no longer a separate criterion, but we just try to incorporate climate resilience in the various other technical evaluation criteria. For example, as part of the technical proposal, there will be potentially a maintenance plan, and maybe one of the evaluation criteria is the quality and robustness of the maintenance plan. Now, as part of the maintenance plan, we could say, wait a minute, we're also interested in, as part of your maintenance. We're interested in your responsiveness to the occurrence of climate hazards. So we're incorporating climate resilience in that way into an already existing evaluation criteria on the quality of the maintenance plan. And again here, we should reflect that in the submission requirements, and we should probably also discuss how that is going to be scored to provide clear direction to bidders and to also indicate how important this is for them to focus on. Moving on to the next tool. So we are now discussing how to either include mandatory requirements or encourage bidders to come up with their plans, but that's only step one. Step two is to make sure that those plans or those requirements are also going to be enforced. So one of the tools in the toolkit is talking about how the contract, and more specifically the payment mechanism, can help enforce those requirements. And again, this is not a new mechanism. Every PPP contract has a payment mechanism, has procedures for default and termination. So we're using the same exact mechanisms. It's just that we now include climate resilience explicitly as well. First question is, are there actually climate-related performance indicators or technical requirements? If not, then okay, we don't have to think about how to enforce them. If yes, because we just included them in the technical specs, or we received climate risk mitigation plans from bidders, then there's three ways to make sure that that is going to be delivered. The first one is to include climate resilience measures in the definition of availability. So we are talking about an availability payment contract. So the definition of availability is one of the main mechanisms in the contract. So what it means is, bidder or developer at that stage, you're only going to get paid if you deliver availability of the roads according to specifications. And one of the specifications is that you're going to meet certain climate resilience standards. That's the first mechanism. Second mechanism is, if it's not, let's say, important enough to include it in the definition of availability, then there's other performance failure mechanisms. So typically these are used for requirements that are important and need to somehow be enforced, but are not do not make it to the definition of availability. So that's a performance failure mechanism. The third mechanism is not directly payment mechanism, but is default and termination. So if there is structural underperformance, that can typically trigger a default and termination procedure under a PPP agreement. And so the same could apply to climate risk mitigation. So if a bidder, later the concessionaire, committed to meeting certain climate resilience standards, to delivering a certain climate risk mitigation plan and measures, then structural non-compliance on those points could eventually lead to default and termination. By the way, just like any other performance standard in the PPP agreement. So how that works in our fictional case is, for example, we were talking about the coastal road. Let's say that we need to include, or that we want to include and can include permeability of the pavement into the definition of availability. So meaning that means that the PPP agreement would now state that availability is defined as the road meeting the following conditions, one of which is a certain level of permeability. The moment the road is no longer meeting that condition, that means that there is an unavailability event leading to an unavailability deduction. The second measure that can actually coexist in the same agreement is performance failure. So, for example, it is quite likely that, or it would actually be a good practice to encourage bidders, or to actually make it mandatory under the agreement for a developer to not only develop a climate risk mitigation plan at bid submission, but also update that plan over time. And so, for example, annually, the concessionaire would have to update the plan. If it's not doing that, and even after the rectification period, that would lead to a performance failure deduction. So that's the second mechanism. The third mechanism in our case, the coastal road, is let's say that now they're structurally underperforming, structurally the road is not meeting the permeability requirements. That means that it leads to eventually leads to termination. What is important here is to consider that we, if you look at the right-hand side of the slide, there's three components. We need KPIs, meaning we need very clear specifications. That's number one. Number two is we need a clear monitoring system. So we need to actually be able to observe that certain requirements are not being met, right? That's the monitoring system. And then we need a payment mechanism. We need a mechanism in the contract to enforce. And so with this fictional case, we hope to have demonstrated how that would work. Again, not a new mechanism, but we can use this mechanism to also enforce climate resilience. So that was a brief snapshot of some of the tools in the toolkit, and I encourage all of you to take a closer look at all the tools that we're presenting. Back to you, Jan-Leo.
Thanks, Marcel. Thanks, Christine. And again, this is just an excerpt of the many tools that the team has identified over the past 18 months. But we might have missed a few, so please have a look, make comments, do suggestion on the toolkit. I think we move to finance with Mathieu Pegon, head of blended finance at IDB Invest. And finance and financing solution have been one of the trickiest parts when we have been working on the toolkit. I think the evidence is tricky. There are not so many examples, and the topic of the additional costs and the issue of bankability comes pretty soon when we try to include resiliency in PPPs. So Mathieu, blended finance, we know is not a one-size-fits-all. I think could be a good instrument, but needs to be applied carefully, needs to be applied in a way that incentivizes and aligns interests instead of disrupting sustainability over the project. So I think for you, the question is, how is IDB Invest doing it? I mean, what are the principles you guys are applying? And if you have practical examples of solutions or products that are working well in resilient infrastructure, especially in a PPP context. Thank you, Mathieu.
Thank you, Jan-Leo, and thanks to the IDB and IMG Rebel for having me. Jan-Leo, I'm gonna assume the video and the sound is okay, but if not, just give me a shout.
We can see you and we can hear you.
Fantastic. So everyone, my name is Mathieu Pegon. I head blended finance at IDB Invest. We manage approximately 800 million of concessional resources, and we've invested those resources in time over 50 investments in Latin America and the Caribbean. And those, the use of those concessional resource has unlocked over 3 billion of investment, to give you a little bit of a background of what I do. I wanted to start by perhaps anchoring the conversation a little bit around what we mean by blended finance. There's a lot of definitions out there. There's no good one and bad one, but there's one that we apply at IDB Invest that I'm going to be discussing a little bit. Then perhaps talking a little bit about this notion in PPP, which is really key when we look at blended finance, is the notion of tendering and how it affects the way we look at blended finance in a PPP context. And finally, I wanted to go through 3 examples of how blended finance can intersect with PPPs, and perhaps discussing a little bit the pro and the cons of each of those approach. So starting with the first point, blended finance. So we define blended finance at IDB Invest as the use of concessional resources in private sector operation. And by concessional resource, we mean any investment that is extended at terms and or conditions that are more favorable than those available in the market. That can mean 2 things. That can mean something cheaper that was available on the market. So it's as if instead of paying market rate for your mortgage loan, I'm going to offer you a subsidized loan. So that's one dimension of concessionality. The second dimension of concessionality is terms such as tenor, such as subordination, that again are not available in the market. Keeping the example of a mortgage loan, typically in the US, you're going to have to be putting 10 to 20% of equity in your house. So let's imagine that all of a sudden, I'm going to make you available a loan where you have to put zero equity. By the way, that exists. Typically, those are subsidized loans by government agencies, and that is considered concessional finance. So really two dimensions to concessional finance. One is sort of pricing, and the other one is structure. Now, why was I referring to a tendering, and how does it affect a blended finance? You would assume that, you know, in a perfect world with a PPP that is perfectly structured, where there's been a right dialogue with the private sectors, where risks have been allocated between the extender of the PPP and the developer, there's no real need for concessionality. There's no real need for blended finance because things have been done correctly. So what are the situations where a blended finance can be made available? Another notion in tendering that is important to take into consideration is that to the extent a project has been tendered and to the extent the project has been awarded to a winner, that means that there is a market to do that PPP on the terms and conditions that were defined by the PPP. So again, you have to be careful when you think about blended finance in that context, because if there's already a market for something, why would you be putting additional concessional resources, bearing in mind that those are generally scarce public resources? And there's sort of really three dimensions where you can look at blended finance in a context of PPP. One is affordability, two is bankability, and three is additionality. So the first one, affordability. This is typically a situation where you want to extend a subsidy, not necessarily to the developer of the PPP, but possibly to the end user. Or the second situation where affordability could be an issue is the entity that is extending the PPP to the developer doesn't necessarily have the resource to pay for that. And so think, for example, at a government with limited financial resources that is going to be doing tenders for microgrids. And that has happened in the region. And you will see in some of those tenders, there is a pot of money in the form of a grant that is extended to the developer to build part of that infrastructure. And as a result of that, decrease the price of electricity when electricity is sold to the end user. So typically what you're looking here to do is really lower the cost for the end user, who's ultimately paying to benefit from that infrastructure. Now, the main danger there is obviously whenever you look at blended finance, a key aspect for us when we use concessional finance in private sector operation is we want those subsidy to be short-term subsidy, because for us it's very important to ensure that whatever we're financing, there's long-term commercial sustainability. And there's been a number of cases in the past where infrastructure were financed through a lot of concessional resources and without necessarily thinking about the commercial sustainability of such infrastructure. And through time, those infrastructures just stop being operated. So, and the other danger whenever you extend subsidy to end users is at some point in time you're going to have to stop, and people generally don't like that. So whenever you think about those schemes, it's also very important to think about what's the exit strategy and come up with a mechanism that one is going to be ensuring alignment of interest between whomever is receiving that subsidy and whomever is channeling it. And second one, also ensuring that the reduction of subsidy is made through time so that it doesn't create sort of any social unrest. Obviously, all of that needs to be done before you tender your infrastructure. because that is going to affect whether people are going to tender for it. It's going to affect any sort of price discovery process that may happen through the tender. So one key feature when you look at affordability interventions in the frame of PPPs is really that all of that should be done before the project is tendered. Otherwise, there's a risk of creating a market distortion. The second dimension is bankability. And here it's really, it again touches the financing. You're already think about a not so great credit. And so even though the risk in principle are adequately balanced and there would be an interest to finance that infrastructure, there's no real certainty about the credit worthiness of the flow of payment that are going to come to pay the developer, and that's what a bank is going to be looking at. And if there's no comfort on the credit quality of those cash flows, that might affect ultimately the availability of financing. And so here, what you're really looking at is, okay, how can I use blended finance to de-risk those flows of payment and ultimately ensure that a commercial bank, so commercial financing, is going to be available to finance that infrastructure. A good example for that, for instance, was in Argentina when the country launched their bids for renewable energy, where there was a concern that the credit quality of the off-taker might create a challenge to get commercial financing available. And so through a blended finance mechanism where the government was partly guaranteeing some of those payments and was in turn counter-guaranteed by the World Bank, you had some level of certainty about the credit worthiness of those cash flows. Again, here, you really want to put that in place before you tender the project, because this is going to ultimately affect how people are going to tender to the project. It's going to affect their bid price, so very important to do that before tendering. There might be occasions where you do bankability intervention post-tendering, and that's typically where something comes up that you have not identified in the design of your PPP. And it happens more often than not, and sometimes it's little things that adds up, and at the end of the day, because of reason X, Y, Z, and perhaps a little change in the overall macro environment, all of a sudden, where you were expecting financing to be available, financing is no longer available. And those are situations where you can possibly provide a blended finance post-tendering. You obviously need to be a little bit careful in how you do it, because you are going to be creating a distortion post the award of the tender. So the way we've been doing that at IDB Invest is, first of all, try to avoid any concessionality in pricing. So we're not trying to increase the economics of the sponsor. I mean, the developer, already bid according to a certain price. So already bid according to certain return expectations. So we're not there to increase those return expectations. What we're there for is to provide financing that was expected to be there, but is no longer there. Very important. You can still provide concessionality in pricing post-tender if you're able to justify that there's been changes, unforeseen changes, that are putting at risk the entire project or the entire program, and those changes were not factored into the original bid. Now, and what you want to avoid is a situation where the entire program stops and has to be retendered. So in those instances, you might want to provide also some subsidy to unlock the financing and the construction of those infrastructure. Now, what is important to do there is, to the extent possible, make that cheaper financing available to all the parties involved in the program. So it's not so much of an issue if it's a single infrastructure with a civil developer, but if you're in PPP schemes with, for example, multiple roads or multiple renewable energy plants, you want to sort of make sure that advantage, that extra advantage, is available to all the players in order to avoid creating a market distortion. The last dimension I want to touch upon is the dimension of additionality, and that one is perhaps the one that ties the most to resiliency, especially in instances where resiliency has not necessarily been included in the design of the PPP at the design stage. And so what we do in those instances is we give ourselves the flexibility of providing concessional finance, including at lower pricing, if we're able to demonstrate that the developer is going beyond the scope of the PPP, whether it's in terms of whether it's in terms of climate resilience, whether it's in terms of environmental, social, and governance practices, or gender and diversity practices. That's an interesting way of including features where they're not necessarily understood well enough, or there's maybe not enough a consensus so that they're included at the design stage of the PPPs. But as a financier, and in our case as a development bank, those are still issues we want to promote within the scope of those infrastructure. And that's a good way of socializing those practices in a given market, so that next time an infrastructure, a similar infrastructure is standard in the same country or in neighboring countries, instead of incentivizing those sustainable practice post-tender, you can build that within the requirements of the PPP, so that this is embedded in the PPP design from the get-go, and then the developers are going to tender on that basis. So this was to give you a little bit of a panorama of how we look at blended finance. Sorry, I see you. So I stopped for a second. The camera stopped. So that was to give you a little panorama of how we look at blended finance in PPP. Obviously, as Gianleo mentioned, it's more an art than science, and there's really different cases from one PPP to another. But happy to answer any question you may have on that. Thank you, Gianleo. Back to you.
Thank you, Mathieu. I think I see it's more an art than science, but I think evidence is increasing, and hopefully, I think by replicating successful models, we can create a bit more, let's say, templates. I think that's what we're trying to do with this toolkit, create like decision makers support systems with templates, simple rules that at least to get started. I think in blended finance, many times it's important to know the enabling conditions and the rule of the game before. Because many times we get approached by, as you said, ideas that sometimes don't have clear implication for long-term commercial sustainability, and think that blended finance is a solution for everything. Please put questions in the platform for Mathieu and the other colleagues, as we like to have a Q&A session at the end. We move to contracts now with Christina Paul from the World Bank. I think PPPs are long-term partnerships, and in long-term partnerships, contracts are crucial. Nevertheless, especially in Latin America, we see that almost 3/4 of all the contracts in PPPs get renegotiated, sometimes even within a year from sign or later. The World Bank has been working on contractual provision for PPPs for a long time now, and if you haven't, please have a look at the 2019 version of the contractual provision, because it includes climate change. So we've been talking with Christina for a while now, and we've been pleased that climate change takes actually a dedicated space in the provisions. Also, in PPPs, force majeure is a key issue, and if you don't know what force majeure is, think about your last 3 months and the fact that we all be working from home, and a lot of business has been forced to shut down. So I think these are all issues in PPPs. So Christina, the questions for you is, how can we support developers, decision makers when structuring this contract in a risk shifting environment due to climate change or due to the presence of natural disasters or force majeure events? And I know you also been thinking about COVID and how this has implication for PP. So really, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Janeo. And as before, please let me know whether either video or audio should not be working.
We can see you in video now. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to the organizers as well for having me. I'm delighted to be on this webinar. As we heard, very pertinent, particularly against the backdrop of, well, I guess yet another crisis, not climate change, but a public health crisis. Well, just to briefly introduce myself once more, my name is Christina Paul. I'm a senior infrastructure finance specialist at the World Bank and working in a department that is particularly looking at infrastructure projects, including PPP, both in terms of the upstream, so sort of ecosystem in which these projects operate, as well as down to transactions. And it is in this space, and Janeo has been so kind to already mention this, that the bank has been doing some work, particularly on contractual clauses that you would typically find in any PPP agreement. It's called the Guidance on PPP Contractual Provisions. We have been working on this various editions since 2015, and as you already heard, have recently last year during late summer published the latest version, the 2019 edition. And it is particularly in this bit, Janeo already hinted at that we received during the drafting stages, during public stakeholder consultations, a lot of inputs as regards the relevance of climate change and obviously the increasing scrutiny that PPP projects face in that respect. So yeah, on to my topic, climate risks and how are these being dealt with in PPP contracts, or how can contracting authorities and private developers alike look at these issues and try to incorporate some measures to make projects better adaptable and resilient to outer shocks. And I'll delve into a couple of areas, not all obviously. It's going to be a brief overview, and I'll close with a bit of an outlook and how relevant this work remains, both of the World Bank but other partners, like we heard today, in these crucial times where, well, yet another crisis has hit home, and where actually the lessons learned that we might have been able to derive from incorporating climate change resilience into PPP projects, and how lessons learned of that might be relevant going forward. Just as a precursor, looking into how climate change risks can be dealt with or incorporated into contractual designs is obviously a twofold question. For once, it's obviously looking at climate change risks and how they might affect the performance of a given project. Think, for instance, flooding of a project facility due to heightened temperatures, landslide, interrupting supply roads, or droughts affecting the water supply of a given project. So that is one, but obviously the other one being what kind of climate change effects might the project in itself have on the environment. So that's obviously the second sort of component that needs to be looked at. And again, just as a little pretext, and as many of the previous speakers have already helpfully pointed out, contract design obviously doesn't work in isolation. It starts much earlier, building resilience into PPP projects, and that's what Christine and particularly Marcel very much talked to, is starting at project preparation, is starting when looking at the feasibility studies that should assess the likelihood of the impact of climate change on the project and vice versa. And it obviously drills down further into the procurement stage, where you can incorporate climate change resiliency into the requirements of your tender documents, which will then obviously directly translate into the envisaged risk allocation when it comes to the occurrence of such climate change events under a given contract design. So the three issues that I would want to briefly touch upon that we particularly looked at in our guidance document is for once, and again, Janeo mentioned it, force majeure is very related to that. Insurance is also obviously KPIs relating to disaster recovery obligations, as well as reporting and monitoring. And last but not least, variations or amendments to contracts that you could look at in this context. So starting off with force majeure, we, and together with the law firm that had been helping us to develop this latest edition of the guidance, we're obviously looking at what is sort of market practice in this area. Is there market practice evolving? And yes, there is, but it is very much in flux. So important to note that it will always depend on the specifics of a given project. There is no one size fits all, and that is also the set of tone and stage that we're trying to take in the guidance. So it's all about illustrating and exploring and indicating options that contracting authorities in particular could look at when drafting their particular provisions for a given project. So broadly speaking, though, I think what we would still mark as current market practices that force majeure, as in unforeseeable events that are beyond the control of either party, and hence will affect performance of obligations under this contract, remain very much a shared risk. So we have not seen too many examples where extreme weather events like caused by climate change or changes in habitat caused by climate change have been solely allocated to one party. It seems to be the case that, at least for now, and again, it is a market evolving practice, it remains a shared risk. So it's something to obviously be looked at in the context of a given project as to whether there is the possibility against historic data. A particular region or particular country might have specific natural disaster risk experience, like Japan, for instance, where you might be able to shift the needle a bit. Generally, there is this recognition that while climate change events, because of their much more frequent occurrence these days, have obviously become more foreseeable, there is still, by far and by large, in most cases, unlikely to be within the affected party's power to prevent, avoid, or to overcome on their own. And so hence, to my earlier point, it remains a shared risk. We have seen, and that is coming back to that example of Japan, for instance, we have seen a couple of examples where, against the backdrop of past experience with natural disasters, certain risks have been excluded from force majeure definitions, or at least they have been qualified. They will only be counting towards a force majeure event if they're, for instance, go beyond a certain threshold that will be set. For instance, earthquakes that are beyond a certain seismic intensity, or for instance, heavy rain that has been occurring over a certain threshold per hour or a 24-hour period, or certain wind speeds that go beyond a certain threshold that is indicated in the contract. And again, like depending very much on circumstances, but these are some of the examples where we've seen that certain type of events have not been included in force majeure definitions. And if that is the case, obviously that would mean at the end of the day that the risk is with the private partner to deal with. Very much linked to that is, and I mentioned that earlier, is insurance. It will obviously play a key part in managing climate change risks if there is actually insurance available in the market to cover some of these type of events. And if so, then very unlikely to be eligible for compensation under a force majeure provision. So at the end of the day, it will be a matter that needs to be carefully assessed by both the respective contracting authority as well as the private partner to see whether the contract should contain clauses that will require the private partner to take out relevant insurance, again, if available, which will obviously add cost to the contract price, but may be better value for money for the contracting authority than bearing the risk itself. It is to be noted, though, and that's something that came out very clearly in consultations, particularly with insurance providers while we were in the drafting stages of the guidance, that you will have to be very careful in assessing whether this insurance is actually available. And then another consideration obviously being that with increasing occurrence of natural disasters or climate change type of events, it may become increasingly hard to actually obtain insurance, as insurance markets obviously respond to this increasing frequency of such events, particularly in certain sectors and regions. And again, looking at our clients, particularly the World Bank clients in emerging markets, some domestic insurance markets might simply not have the capacity to insure certain events. So that's something to be taken into account, and to be assessed on a project by project basis. The third point that I mentioned earlier that I briefly wanted to touch upon is key performance indicators. Marcel and Christine actually provided quite a bit of detail on that, and so maybe not too much need to delve into more detail here, but just to say that obviously if you are able as a contracting authority to in your tender documents to request or to require certain parameters that are related directly to either disaster recovery and or mitigation or prevention, it will obviously be important to manage that over the lifetime of the contract, to monitor that and to have the private partner report on those, and to incentivize the private partners to do that by, for instance, introducing deductions from payments where measures are below specifications that have been agreed upon. The last bit that I wanted to briefly mention here are, at the end of the day, amendments and variations to contracts. And I'll spend maybe a minute or two on that because it's becoming increasingly of an issue that we're seeing right now against the backdrop of the current COVID-19 pandemic as well. Obviously, you can, and most contracts will have by their nature clauses that will allow for variations to contracts. The question now becoming, should there be bespoke clauses that will actually allow for a change management mechanism that is tailored to climate change events or any type of outer shock, if you so will, or pattern of events if and while they're occurring. And this is really against the backdrop of particularly current experience, that typical clauses like you would have in any given PPP agreement, like force majeure, like materially adverse effect, like change in law, for instance, so relief mechanisms that are at the end of the day not tailored to cater to such catastrophic events unfolding, and do not have the necessary coordination, and at the end of the day communication mechanisms between both partners of a PPP to come together and find practical and commercial workarounds that go beyond the clauses that you will have at the end of the day of the contract. So that is really feedback that we're getting very imminently right now from PPP units, contracting authorities in countries that we're working in, indicating that the contracts that have been working for the past couple of years, or the typical PPP agreements, do not allow for the flexibility to actually deal with outer crises like the pandemic, but also looking to lessons learned as to what has worked or what could be possible avenues to remedy this going forward. And I think the one area where there could be some lessons learned derived, and where I think the toolkit that was presented earlier is so important, is that this can be one of the lessons learned to sort of leading the way ahead of how we're dealing going forward with outer crises and shocks within both PPP contract design, but quite frankly, much earlier in preparation, in procurement. And I think that would be the closing note there that I would close on, or like to conclude my intervention. And it goes even beyond that. It will have to go, and I think Ricardo mentioned this in his opening. It actually goes to the frameworks, to the ecosystem in which PPP projects and infrastructure projects are operated, the legal and regulatory environment, and how to build flexibility and sufficient resilience into these frameworks, which will then trickle down to actually allowing for that flexibility and mechanisms in contracts as well. And maybe to leave the audience with a bit of a thought-provoking note, is the PPP model, as we have been operating on for the past years, is this really well entailing sufficient flexibility? Would it be apt? Will it work for the future, or is that not something that might need to be looked at in more detail again, to see where we can actually make this more adaptable and resilient to allow for projects to deal better with these kind of outer shocks and crises like climate change events, natural disasters, but at the end of the day also a crisis like we're facing it right now. Let me close here. I see you want to come in.
Thank you, Christina. Yeah, I think your thought about flexibility is tricky. It seems to us that sometimes lack of flexibility has been used as a shortcut, to make things easier to manage, and that sometimes flexibility comes with the challenge of being able to manage the flexibility. Let's say we have one question for Marcel and Christine, one for Mathieu, and one for you. Marcel, you mentioned in the toolkit the ability to understand whether the developer has sufficient experience or not. How do you think PV agencies could be able to define what sufficient experience is? How could they be able to fail or pass a design proposal for this? And what are the main challenges to implement this in real life? I said Marcel, but I see Christine and Christine.
Yeah, Marcel has asked me to respond.
Please.
It's a good point. So I think you're referring to sort of at the RFQ stage when you're evaluating potential bidders based on their experience. So to ensure that it's not just totally subjective and, that there's a clear-cut process there, in the request for qualification document, they would need to lay out like the approach for how that would be evaluated. So for instance, they could, well, first, before you even get to that point, it really should only be done in cases where you see that this is really important for the project. So the project has high climate risk, and you need to ensure that whoever, what bidder wins to develop the project and manage it over its life, has that experience in managing similar types of projects of similar types of complexity with those climate risks. So in the RFQ stage, the request for qualification document should really lay out what they need to submit. So for example, the RFQ documentation could ask for them to submit and provide a form, please provide 2 projects of similar complexity with regards to climate risks and how you went about managing those risks. And then maybe you could go prescribing further how that would be evaluated. So it really just needs to be very clear cut and not kind of a vague just requirement, so that to leave room for just a lot of subjectivity. So I hope that answered the question. Marcel, if you want to add anything, please do.
I see Marcel nodding, so.
Works for me. Yep.
Mathieu, quick question. Have you seen example of projects becoming unfinanceable or unbankable due to climate risk? And let's say, how do you, as IDB Invest, assess whether you can do something or whether the risk is too bad or is being managed quite badly from the proponent of the investment, and you decide to walk away? Mathieu, I think you're on mute. Oh,
Okay, now I can unmute myself. I was saying it's a good question. I don't think we've seen cases that extreme where the entire financing of the infrastructure will be put at risk because of climate risk. But we're getting there, and insurances, for example, is a good one. I mean, we've seen cases where fairly down the road in the financing of the infrastructure, we realize that there's no insurance available, and this is to some extent correlated to climate risk. And I'm thinking in particular about projects in the Caribbean, where a number of instances you will want to get insurance against hurricanes, for instance, and there's simply no market for that, or the cost of the insurance is so prohibitive that it sort of defeats the purpose of seeking insurance to begin with. Now, that is from a blended finance perspective, the example I gave you. That would be more of a sort of a more permanent market failure. So typically when we think about market blended finance and how we use blended finance, we're really looking at sort of short-term market failures. So we wouldn't necessarily be using concessional finance to make up for the price of the insurance, but we could be using blended finance, for instance, to support an insurance market. Or and one thing we're looking at, actually using the same example, is whether we can support the establishment of a climate risk market in the Caribbean for certain utilities, more on a mutual base, because that would allow them subsequently to seek reinsurance on the market. And this is something that might warrant the use of concessional finance. So it's not so much subsidizing the insurance because otherwise the project doesn't work, but rather, okay, how can I use blended finance to support the creation of the insurance market, which will then in turn allow that infrastructure to be financed.
Thank you. And Christina, quick question for you. You mentioned the example of Japan, and now in certain countries risk are being qualified. Do you think this will be, let's say, the new modus operandi looking forward? And what are the, say, what can we do as a sector to support the definition of these thresholds? I mean, you mentioned also insurance. And what are the challenges to get to those thresholds?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it, Jandio?
Well, that's wise for you.
Yeah, absolutely. No, so listen, for once, I mean, I think one thing is for sure, this will become an increasingly, even more so increasingly important topic for, quite frankly, governments and private sector alike to look at. I'm not sure whether you'd seen the recent survey that the Global Infrastructure Hub did. They surveyed practitioners in the infrastructure space in I think around 70 countries, both emerging and more developed markets, concerning megatrends and what they see, you know, as the pertinent issues for the infrastructure program going forward. Now, obviously, access to finance, particularly for emerging markets, remains one of those, but consistently ranked by both groups the highest, I guess, both in terms of likelihood of occurrence as well as magnitude of impact, was resilience. Resilience for infrastructure projects, and obviously PPP in particular. So again, it's difficult to sort of predict how varying regions and countries will deal with that, but I think it's safe to assume that we'll need to come to more standard practices as we go forward. As I said, status quo last year, when we were looking at you know, a number of countries and potential examples that you could point contracting authorities to, you would still have to say that this is emerging practice. I think we will see this accelerate massively right now, just because of the immense demand, particularly in emerging markets, to tackle these kind of issues upfront rather than adapting contracts later on, because that is obviously, as everyone would appreciate, its own difficulty. And I guess we'll see. We're in constant dialogue with both private sector and governments, whether, you know, the current flood of force majeure declarations that you see left, right, center will actually lead to disputes playing out, projects failing. So far, I think it's too early to tell. That's what everybody sort of points to. But at the same time, I think, and then that is particularly what governments have started thinking about. We have set up a forum with PPP units around the world, particularly against the impacts of the COVID-19 crisis. The number one issue on their mind is how can I make sure going forward that not only do I make my current PPP contracts more resilient, sort of avoid the kind of hiccups that we're having right now, but quite frankly, going forward, changing priorities in PPP programs, maybe more focus on the sort of projects that would be in the health, in the education sector, maybe, you know, in the environmental and social space. And then again, like, how do I make sure that my frameworks are actually, adapt and have the right kind of structures built into those so that we can actually leverage the private sector with its expertise too. And I think we heard a lot about that, what the private sector can actually contribute there, both in terms of technology, but also information gathering. And you will need that at the end of the day for any climate change and other type of outer shock related risks being reflected in contract designs and as well as frameworks. I know a bit of a long-winded answer and not very clear because I wish I had a crystal ball, but just to say that I think for all of us here on the call, both private sector, development partners and governments alike, it will be a space to work on collaboratively because else I do not think these issues and challenges can be tackled.
Thank you, Christina. And I will ask the audience a couple of minutes more of patience because I would like to invite our partner in crime in this from DBJ, Ricardo Muro, to give a few closing remarks and reflections. Ricardo has been hoping that the outage in Kingston was resolved and he can join us. Ricardo has been and DBJ as a whole has been a key partner in this because they actually agreed to be a bit our guinea pigs to test this idea, to test whether we could really start working on systematization of climate risk management in the PPP process. And they've been very open in the way things are done now, in the challenges. And we really thank you, Ricardo, thank DBJ for really helping us in producing this work. Ricardo, I cannot hear you, I cannot see you, but I can hear you. So
let me share my screen.
Thank you.
Hi, just doing a sound check. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Great. So this has been a very good webinar series. There has been a good cross-section of content and perspectives, and we have seen interesting presenters. And of course, the star of the show has been the toolkit, a very comprehensive toolkit. DBJ is now in implementation mode, and in a short while, you will see evidence of this in the projects that we'll put out. I mean, we are ensuring that our current pipeline is reassessed to ensure that the lessons that we have learned throughout this case study and the tools that we have been exposed to are put into practice. And you have seen that commitment not only from the DBJ, but from PIMSEC and from the other partners that work along with DBJ in developing PPPs. And we are very excited and we anticipate seeing the results of this work very shortly. So I would like to thank, of course, the presenters. I'd like to thank the participants, and I'd like to thank the organizers of this webinar series, for allowing us to showcase our case study in Jamaica. I mean, we graciously accepted being the guinea pigs because we thought this was interesting and important work. And of course, the participants and the presenters throughout this webinar series have contributed to the discussion and enriched what we have learned so far and even reinforced it. So, from TBJ, on behalf of the government of Jamaica, would like to just thank you all for participating and going on this journey with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Ricardo. Nothing left but for thanking the speakers, the presenters today, Christina, Mathieu, Ricardo, the Ricardos, Christine and Marcel, thanking and IMB Rebel for helping us in this project, and thanking DBJ and also the IDB team. I think is I've been kind of like the face in these webinars most of the time, but the effort has been really from the climate change divisions, from the PPP unit, from our team in Kingston in Jamaica, and all the, let's say, the wider community working climate issues at the IDB. The toolkit again will be in open consultation until the end of July, and as Ricardo mentioned, we are already thinking on implementation. There will be more capacity building activities. We hope also there is an interesting initiative from the Global Commission of Adaptation on climate risk and PPPs, in which this work we hope can be featured, can support. Without further ado, thank you very much to the speakers and the audience, and to the next time. Thank you.